All right, case studies. So up to this point in the course, we've been talking about research that really provides generalizations because it looks at a lot of participants. And in this case, we're going to go completely the opposite. We're going to talk about single cases. And when I say single cases, I'm not referring necessarily just to a single person. It is possible that there are actually several people considered as a single case. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But case studies are unique situations, people, circumstances that really allow us some insight into unusual or kind of outlier sort of contexts. The first example I'm going to use in this lecture is the use of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II. What's of course terrible about this is it cost 250,000 civilian lives, ended the war effectively, but it's actually served as enough of a case study to prevent other countries from utilizing nuclear weapons in war in the 70 plus years that have passed, almost 70 years that have passed since then. Actually, no, almost 80 years that have passed since then, right? So it served as a case study, and I want you to keep that in mind as we move through this. The different examples can make a big difference. We're going to talk about what a case study is, how we design experiments around a case study, what strategies we might use for an experiment in that case, and how we evaluate the data in case studies. So what makes a case study a case study? So the big characteristics, one, a very intensive study, I would underline intensive, of the individual. In this case, as I said, a person, a family, an institution, a state, what have you. All right. So there's a family, and I believe they're from Kentucky, the Blue family of Kentucky. If you do a Google image search, it'll pull it up. And this family has a very anomalous genetic condition where their skin is blue. They look like Smurfs. It looks photoshopped. They are, in fact, blue. Right. That's a case study. In this case, it's not just a person, it's a whole family. Right. The information, because you're doing such an intensive study, though, needs to be richly detailed. Serial killers, for example, are often considered case studies because they look at every aspect of that individual's life, including what they did as children. So, for example, Jeffrey Dahmer, among many serial killers, was known for torturing and maiming animals when he was just little, like 5 years old, right? Why do we need to know that? Because that adds to the context of the fact that he was a serial killer. And notice the third point. There are efforts to include the complexity and nuance of the case. This is the complete opposite of what we do with most quantitative research. We don't care about the complexity. We don't care about the nuances. We care about the generalizability. Generalizability is the name of the game for most quant, whereas single case studies are the complete opposite. What makes this unique? What contexts, what factors and influences really make this separate from everything else? And then, unfortunately, most of the information is going to be retrospective. There's not a lot of case studies that are ongoing. So it's not ideal. Ideally, case studies would be identified while they are still going, but often that's not possible because for a variety of reasons. We'll talk more about that in a moment. So you might be saying to yourself, okay, well, if we've got all this quantitative research where we can, do research on 1,000 people or 500 people, how can we actually get any useful conclusions from a single case study, especially if it's not generalizable? Let me offer a counterpoint to that argument: the life of Jesus Christ, right? That is an excellent case study. The Bible, in fact, is just a huge case study, right? The Son of God, God on earth, essentially, as it were, right? The life of Christ. Why did we need Christ? Why did he come down and die for our sins? The whole thing is a massive case study. And obviously, in the 2,000 years plus that have passed since then, clearly it is still a very valuable case study. And I want to throw out there too, you might say, well, only Christians really value that. No, I disagree. If you were to consider history objectively, whether or not you accept Christ as the Son of God or the existence of God itself, that his life and the Bible itself is the most influential book of the human race, right? And this is just trying to demonstrate the true value of a case study. This is how important and influential the study itself can be, as well as the outcomes of it. So, as I said, the value. Where are the tangible values, right? To begin with, the source of ideas and hypotheses. I love the Bible, not because it has all the answers, which it has many answers, but it has so many other ideas and questions. I think it's brilliant, right? It's there in black and white for us to read, both for the questions and for the answers, right? From a Christian point of view, too, it allows us for new therapeutic techniques. Can we take what we've learned about this particular case and apply it to new treatments and new therapeutic techniques? I would underline this third bullet point. It is the study of a rare phenomenon, right? I don't know. I mean, we've only had one coming of our Messiah, right? He will return, but it's only happened once in the last 2,000 years. So it is a rare phenomenon. It doesn't happen all the time. Okay, the use of the atomic bomb in World War II. Didn't happen. This has not happened since then, thank God. Right? It also provides a counter instance. It's an outlier. So I don't know of a lot of virgin births. I don't know a lot of people that can walk on water, change water into wine, feed thousands with just a few fish and loaves of bread. Counter instance, right? We actually talk about this in social psych. What's fascinating about religion, and then also more specifically Christian religion, is it provides what's called minimal counterintuitiveness. Right? Jesus Christ was born of a woman. He didn't explode out of a volcano like some sort of superhero, right? If he had done, you probably wouldn't be inclined to believe it. But the fact that even though it was a virgin birth, he was still born the way all the rest of us are, right? So it provides this minimal counterintuitiveness, a counter instance. And then also, of course, persuasive and motivational value. I mean, the Bible, arguably, regardless of how literal you take the Bible, obviously is a great source of persuasive and motivational value. Another example, another of a case study, Phineas Gage, and I imagine you guys probably remember this from General Psych back in the day. Poor man, actually in 1848, had a 6-foot tamping pole shot through his head. Basically, it was essentially like a bullet, but it was a 6-foot bullet. Went through his lower left cheek, just below his eye, and exited through the top of his frontal lobe through his skull. He never lost consciousness. Didn't die, didn't lose consciousness. In fact, lived, I believe, for another 20, I want to say 22 years for some reason. That number's sticking in my mind. And that's his actual skull there on the right there. There's a plaster cast of his face on the left, but that picture on the far right, that's actually his skull. And that's a picture of him on the bottom right with the pole that ended up, nearly killing him, which I think is kind of a cruel thing. Like the photographer's like, hey, can you pose with this thing that nearly killed you? Anyway, whatever. But he's a case study because in 1848 he survived a massive TBI, which is just unheard of. And at the time, 1848, they had no ability to treat him, right? He didn't die of infection. He didn't die related to the injury at all, right? It's phenomenal. And the idea that somebody would survive that over 150 years ago is just unbelievable. He's one of the first documented cases of a massive TBI that was survived, and thus it makes him a case study. So what are the limitations? Obviously, not everything about this is great. One of the limitations is there is a lot of anecdotal information, right? It's not very objective. So if you look up Phineas Gage, most of what we know about Phineas Gage is from people that knew him, right? It's not directly from him. It's from people that knew him. So they describe how he was before the accident and then how he was after the accident. So it's anecdotal and, of course, very subject to interpretation. And if you think of the Bible, how much of the Bible was actually written by God? None of it. Not a word. How much of it was written by Jesus? None of it. Not a word. It was all written by people who knew Jesus. A letter from Paul to the Corinthians, right? We always hear this. I don't think we think of it much, but it's not penned by God and it's not penned by Jesus. It's written by people that knew them and so knew Jesus. And so there is some argument that okay, well, it's judgment, it's subjective. You get the idea. Also, alternative explanations are available, right? Because there's not an objective nature to it, you could provide other explanations. And I've seen people try and apply science to different aspects of the Bible, right? So how did Moses part the Red Sea? Well, the Red Sea could have parted this way while Moses was standing there. This sort of thing, right? How did Jesus turn water into wine? Well, if he'd actually, used this process, it would have seemed like water and then it became wine. You get the idea, right? And of course, as I said from the very start, it's not generalizable. So even though there's so much to be gained from certain case studies, they lack generalizability, and for some people they don't lack very much value. They don't have very much value because of the lack of generalizability. Other limitations is essentially we only have one. In so many case studies, we only have one instance, right? One use of the atomic bomb in war, one coming of our Messiah, right? One planet to show the process of macroevolution. And with this argument back and forth, oh, is it creationism? Is it evolution? We only really have one case to point to. We can point to the Bible and say the Bible tells us about the story of creation, 7 days and nights in which the Lord created our planet and the universe, right? Or from the other side, you could say, well, evolution is clearly a natural process, and that's how we got here. Well, okay, but we've only ever seen it play out on this planet. If evolution is a natural process, presumably we'll see it play out on other planets. And I'm just playing devil's advocate in this case, but this is what a case study is all about, is because you only have one instance, it's very easy to try and argue against it, right? So what are some characteristics of the designs? And I want to spend a bit of time on this slide here. This is very important. Because we only have one participant, right? we have to make sure that all the data we need comes from that individual. If we have 500 participants, we only need to gather a little bit amount of data, a little data from each one to provide a substantial amount of data. But if we only have one participant, we need a whole lot of data from that person. All right. In this case, we're going to utilize what's called continuous assessment. We want to make sure that we assess. Oh, excuse me, I'm yawning. We want to assess as continuously as possible. Maybe add that to your notes. Right. Continuous assessment can be a bad thing if we do it too much. We want to make sure that we assess at a rate that is feasible, plausible. We'll talk more about that in a second. Ideally, we would also have a baseline assessment, what it was like before. And I love that there's a part of the Old Testament devoted to the before Christ, a substantial amount of the Old Testament, devoted to why we needed Christ, why Jesus had to come and die for our sins, right? This provides us baseline assessment. Likewise, we have pictures of what Hiroshima and Nagasaki looked like prior to the atomic bomb. Okay, this allows us to see what it was like prior to and really fully understand the context of what it was like after. Stability of the performance. This is important. Actually, if I was making notes, I would connect this back to both continuous assessment and baseline assessment. Essentially, we want to see that the performance of the individual or the situation was continuous before the case study as well as after. Right? And we'll talk more about that in a second. I think that can be a little bit confusing, but people knew how Phineas Gage acted prior to his accident, right? He was trustworthy, kind, church-going, soft-spoken, hardworking, just a good man by all assessments, right? So his behavior in that case was very stable. What they found is after his accident, he essentially suffered a full frontal lobotomy in his accident. He became aggressive, rude, hostile, unreliable, also developed a drinking problem, right? And so what we're looking at is how stable was the performance before and how stable was it afterwards, and what this reveals about the accident and the nature of the case study. That fourth point there, use of different phases, this is actually much more applicable to the research of a case study, like the formal research of a case study, while the case study is still active, right? We'll talk actually more about that in a second. I'll need to show you the slide for that. But the reason why we are so rigorous in the experimental design of case studies is because we have a limited amount of participants, obviously in this case almost always just one, and so we really need to extract as much viable data from that single source as we can, with respect for the fact that the source most likely probably needs treatment and therapy as well as measurement. So we got to keep that in mind. We always want to make sure that the treatment of the case study is held paramount even over the collection of data.